Okay, it says we are live on Google. This week we're doing something a little different. It's more like a fireside chat with the Rob. So I wanted to start off, if I can mouse, and when it hits that white spot, it just disappears from my brain there. I want to start off talking about a man named Shlomo. A lot of people don't know who Shlomo is. Well, you've heard of King Solomon, right? That guy they say is the smartest man that ever lived. Really? If you believe that God walked in the flesh and you believe God was a man, because walking in the flesh would make God a man, wouldn't he be the wisest one? And if he had a son, if you believe in that stuff, the Trinity thing, wouldn't that guy be the smartest man? Anyway, let me say what I had to say about that. So some people think that Shlomo, the guy they call Solomon, King Solomon, they think he was the wisest man who ever lived because he was very educated, I guess, and could outsmart anyone else. After all, he ordered a baby to be chopped in half. And in doing so, the real mother jumps over the baby and says, "No, kill me instead of the baby, or let the baby go to the other woman," or, she's trying to save the baby. And the woman who was trying to steal a baby, she didn't seem to care at all. Of course, that's Hollywood's version of it. Maybe we should look that up in the Bible and see if that's how it went down, but I'm sure it wasn't far from that. And so it was like, wow, who thinks like that? He must be the smartest guy, the wisest man that ever lived, right? Well, the reality is this. Shlomo married a whole bunch of women. Which was a huge, and dare I say, unwise move on his part. The Bible says not to do that, right? And he built a lot of forts all over the place. The Bible says not to do that. He had gazillions of horses for his armies. The Bible says not to do that. I mean, this guy kind of didn't follow the Bible much, did he? At least at one portion of his life. I mean, he brought in all these wives and they brought in their idols into his home. And then he worshiped those idols with these women after God Almighty, handed him the, jackpot lottery win of all time, made him wealthy beyond belief, made him commander of the largest army probably in their, no doubt in their area, powerful people who had a powerful God who protected them. And he was worshiping things carved out of stone and wood in his own house. Yeah, he was a wise one. Maybe a wise guy. I don't know. And what was the result of all of that not living according to the God who gave him all that? Well, he all but went stark raving mad, didn't he? Vanity, vanity, vanity. He's like total bipolar. Well, not exactly. Whether he went stark raving mad or not, or almost reached that point, we don't know. You can't tell from the writing style of Ecclesiastes, as it's called in the West, because it's a writing style. It's not a man pouring out his insanity and then at the very last sentence becoming sane. That's nonsense. It's not what went down. But you read it and it seems like a journey through insanity. It's supposed to, such that we as the reader get the idea maybe we don't want to live that way. Maybe we want to live the other way, because that was the point. You don't want to go down that road. You want to go down this one. Okay. Shlomo wasn't considered the wisest man who ever lived because he ordered a baby to be chopped in half and then, proving who the mother was. No. He was considered the wisest man who ever lived because of a single sentence. A single sentence that he wrote, or is at least accredited to have written. And it's the very last sentence in the letter called Ecclesiastes in the West. So what I want to do is read to you my translation and give you a little bit of commentary, if you will, to go with that translation so that we get a good translation, right? By the way, if Google were to stop, I wouldn't know that. So you guys, Donna, send me a thing on my little dinger there so that I'll know. Okay. It comes from what they call Ecclesiasticus chapter 12, verse 13. I had 13:13. That's not right. 12:13. And at least I think that's where it is. In my translation, it says, let us shema. The summation of these devarim. Reverence God and shamar his mitzvot. For this, keeping his commandments, is the totality of mankind. All right. I want you to see what I'm actually doing here. He said, let us shamar, let us hear, the English word hear. But remember, in Hebrew, to shamar is to hear with your physical ears. These things. To understand with your whole heart and mind. There is no difference in Hebrew between the heart, the mind, the soul. All of those three things that we can divide it up into in the West, they don't exist in biblical Hebrew at all. They are all three one and the same. So if it does say you're hear with your ears, understand with your heart, and obey or listen, or usually it's obey, that's actually in there. There is a verse actually written that way. But it was somebody trying to explain what shamar meant. So if you hear it with your physical ears and you understand it with your whole heart and mind and you don't obey, it's really more important to obey than just act upon it. Because you can act upon it and you technically, shamar has taken place. But if you disobey it or you act upon it in a way that's contrary to the intended meaning, you haven't shamar, you haven't heard. So if I am in front of a crowd of people and I say, man, I am thirsty, and somebody gets up and hands me a bottle of water, then they have heard with their whole ears. They've understood with their whole heart, mind, soul, strength, all of those things as one in the way of thinking according to the Bible. And they've acted upon it. But in a way, it's more than that. They've obeyed my request, even though my request was not direct. Hey, will you get up and get me a glass of water or a bottle of water, sir, sitting in that chair over there, right? And I'm looking down at this imaginary sir in an imaginary chair. If on the other hand, I say, man, I'm thirsty, and that imaginary person, and I'm looking at the guy when I'm saying it, that person just sits there because he's like, well, I'm not getting up and going and getting him anything. Well, technically, shamar has taken place. He heard it with his ears, he understood it, and decided not to do it. So technically that is shamar, because there was a reaction in the non-reaction. But in the Bible, we really need to think of this more as obedience. In the one that got up and got the bottle of water and brought it to the person who said whatever it was that was said. In this case, I'm thirsty. Hopefully you follow that. So to shamar, or to hear, is to hear with your ears, understand with your whole heart, soul, mind, strength, put all of it together, and it's to obey, especially if God is the one you're supposedly listening to. Okay, and so he says, in this case, this isn't God. This is Shlomo. You're not going to be punished. There's not going to be a lightning bolt falling from the sky because you didn't obey, but your life might be a wreck if you don't, because, again, he's the wisest man, right? Yeah. Okay, so he's saying, hear these devarim, hear these words. And he's saying, listen to everything I just said in this book, in this scroll. In his case, it would be a scroll. We call it a book these days, though I don't know why we would call it a book, because it's a whole bunch of different, just one of those letters that is part of a book. I mean, that makes more sense to me, but whatever. So this letter that we call Ecclesiastes, that's what he's saying. Hear all of these words. See the horror that happens when you don't obey God. And then look at how. Then he says, reverence God. And yours probably says fear, because back when this was translated into English, that's what reverence was called, fear. Not because we think of fear as if you're trembling, it's because you're scared. It's like your knees knocking together, I think is how Gesenius, if I recall right, described that. Well, that's fine in the 1900s, maybe even as far back as the 1800s, but you go back to the 1500s and prior, no, fear was reverence. And the word does mean reverence in Hebrew. It can be used to fear, yes, and often is, but you've got to look at the context. He is not telling you to be scared of God. There's no reason. If you're obeying God, if you're living according to God's wishes, his will, his desire, i.e. his Torah, biblically speaking, then you have nothing to fear from God. Nothing. Okay, so he says, so reverence God and shamar, keep. To keep, it's like someone tending to a garden, right? You prepare soil. You make sure it has lots of nutrients in that soil. You plant your seeds and you make sure that there's enough water in that soil, because it needs good soil. Whatever you're planting, it makes no difference. It needs good soil, and it needs the right kind of soil. Let's put it that way, and it needs the right amount of water. Too much water will kill it. Not enough water will kill it. Too many nutrients can literally kill a plant, and not enough can literally kill it. It has to have a certain amount of everything, including sunlight, in order for it to thrive. And that's what you want, right? I mean, if you're going to plant an apple tree, do you really just want to get 2 or 3 apples a year, or maybe none? You want to see that tree fall down dead one day? I mean, so you're paying attention to its needs. And then as time goes on, because of the good nutrients and the right amount of water, what happens? Well, here come the weeds. They come all over the place. So what do you got to do? Well, you're keeping this stuff, right? You're there to keep that garden. You planted it, and you're you're keeping it. So you're going to pull the weeds out carefully so that you're not yanking up your plant with it, right? Different situation when you're talking about a whole field of wheat and you're trying to take they call it tares, the weeds out of that. Well, you probably better wait till you get to the threshing floor, because when you shake that thingy around in the thingy and throw it up in the air, the lighter weight tares or wheat, or not wheat. What am I talking about? Though I just said it. Weeds. They float off, and the good stuff comes back down. So that works, as you know, that worked differently, of course. But when you're thinking of more of a, you're going to pull the weeds, you're going to make sure, continue the right amount of water, continue the right amount of nutrients in the soil. You're going to have to fight the battle, because if you're planting food in particular, plants in particular, you're going to have to fight the battle of, how do I keep those 4,000 bazillion jillion they got the horns if they're boys, deer from eating those plants? How do I keep the twice as many deer, in the rabbits from eating the carrots and whatever else rabbits eat? And how do I keep the chickens from eating? Because I found out that my chickens like the stuff I was planting, so we got rid of the chickens. But anyway, all of that, he's saying, apply that kind of attention to the words that he wrote in this very scary story. Reverence God. Keep, hear those words, reverence God, and then keep his mitzvot. Mitzvotai is the actual word used in the sentence, which is, we've added the I sound onto the end of the word mitzvah. So it becomes mitzvotai because it's plural. Anyway, he's saying you got to treat the commandments of God that way, not the devarim, as in what's translated as the 10 commandments. It comes from the word devarim. It does not come from the word mitzvot. The 10 devarim should never have been translated 10 commandments. It should have been translated 10 categories, because all of the mitzvot of God are going to fall under one and sometimes more of one of those 10 categories. There is some crossover here and there, but they'll firmly be under one of the 10, right? Those are supposed to be categories, not commandments as we think of them. Mitzvot is the Hebrew word we translate as commandments, not devarim. That word, that means word, but it's used of in English. That should be 10 categories, not even 10 words, because we don't understand the use of devar, of word, or devarim, words, the way that is used in Hebrew. We don't really use it in the same way in English. So anyway, he is saying you've got to keep God's commandments as if it's a garden. You're constantly going in there and making sure that all is well and all is right. I don't know how else to describe that. Then he says, for this, well, what's the this? Keeping the mitzvot. That is the this. Keeping the mitzvot, his commandments, is the totality of mankind. Okay. Poink. Press that button because I almost forgot about that. This one sentence caused Shlomo to be remembered as the wisest man who has ever lived, because he summed up the totality of mankind with this one sentence, followed by the words of this sentence gives, or following the words of this sentence, gives us our path in life, no matter what we do or where we go. If we live according to this verse, we know the answer to every question in life, because we compare the question to that which the mitzvot, the commandments, accomplish. We know the answer to every question in life. We know the answer to every question in life because we compare every question in life to that which is written in the commandments. This one verse tells us how to know that which God wants from us. Do you hear me? This one verse tells us how to know that which God wants from us, that which God will and will not do to or for us, that which we can and cannot do, and that which we should and should not expect from God or from life. We know this because everything, absolutely everything we need to know, do and do not do, is covered by these mitzvot. They cover everything needed, not everything wanted, not every puzzling question of how we got here and the universe and all of that. Why is that not there? Because we didn't need to know. Or because our little pea brains couldn't possibly comprehend it. God knows the limits of the brain he designed. Some of us have more limits than some others, but God knows the limits. So when life comes at us fast, we slow it down by taking the time to consult God's commandments. By living this way, we know that we hear, understand, and obey the voice of God. More importantly, that we hear the voice of God. God's quiet, still voice is spoken in the words of the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Torah and the prophets. That's what it was called back in the day. We call it the Tanakh now because now we have to have the I forget what you call this, but these are three letters that represent three different things. The T or T sound at the beginning, that's for Torah because it's first and foremost above all. Then the N or noon, the noon or the N sound in the middle, that's for the Nevi'im. That's the prophets, like Moshe who wrote the Torah. He's not more important than the Torah. He's just the guy who wrote it, right? But he was a prophet, without a doubt. Then the Ketuvim, the writings, that just kind of covers everything else that's in the book. They didn't call it that. Up until the 2nd century CE, the entire book, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the writings, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, all of that was simply called the Torah. A lot of people don't know that. Especially, it surprises me how many Jews don't know that. So when you're reading something in the New Testament letters and somebody says, oh yeah, the Torah says this, and you're like, no, it doesn't. That's in the book of Psalm. No, it doesn't. That's in the book of the prophets. Or yeah, because back in that time, the whole book was called the Torah. The separating it down to the 5 books associated with the writing of Moshe. Nah, that did not exist back then. It just didn't. So, anywho, we call it the Tanakh because we have subdivided it into three different things. But if we live according to the mitzvot, according to the commandments of God, we know that we hear his voice, that we're literally hearing the voice of God when we're reading the commandments and we're saying, I'm going to do that. A simple one: wear the fringe on the four corners of your or place the ziziot, the fringes, in the four corners of your outer garment, it says. And so that confuses people. All of a sudden, your outer garment has to be square so that you can put one in the four corners, because they didn't get that when God said four corners in the Bible, or anyone said four corners, they're talking about it goes on everything, not just the corners, on everything. So if I wear this talit, which has four literal corners as we think of them, if I wear the fringe only in one or two corners, that's actually okay. You're only supposed to wear a fringe on the outer garment of everything. The number of fringe has nothing to do with it. The reason why we say four corners is to tell you that it's supposed to be on everything that covers you. I'd have to go back and look. I don't remember if it's just speaking of what you wear as in an outer garment, which I think is what it says, or if you would have to, for instance, you lay under a sheet or a blanket, maybe you have to do it there. Again, I'd have to go. I used to know the answer to that, but I've just drawn a blank here. I don't remember the verse itself. So it's either wearing on an outer garment or it's wearing on anything that covers you. It's one of the two. Look it up. I'm sure even the English translation should tell you that. If you're not sure about it, let me know and I'll look it up. I just don't remember. But if we live according to God's law, we know that we hear his voice. His quiet, still voice is spoken in the words of the Tanakh, the whole thing. It is quiet and still only when we are quiet and still. Think about it. If somebody's whispering to you and they're standing right next to you, but there's so much noise going on outside you can't even hear yourself think, you're not going to hear that one, are you? So if God's voice is quiet and still, how can you possibly hear it if you're not quiet and still? Just throwing that out there. It is like a rushing mighty wind when we hear it with ferocity. When we keep his mitzvot, is to hear it with ferocity. But the main thing to remember is it can only be heard if we are listening, understanding, and obeying. If we ask, should I take this new job? And we follow that question with, man, the pay is great, the hours are good, blah, blah, blah. We will find the voice of God impossible to hear. If we instead follow with, well, I have to go to work on the Shabbat. Will I be allowed? Will I have to work on the holidays? Will I be allowed to wear my fringe? Questions like that. We will probably find and hear that quiet, still voice, because the answer is already there. God tells us we must celebrate the Shabbat. We must celebrate his holidays. We must wear our fringe. Now, if you come into this And, like so many of this group of people, including myself, if we come into observance having not been in observance, for instance, we used to have a member of the congregation. He and his family have left. We've not seen him since. It's been years. As far as I'm concerned, they're still part of this congregation. They're still my kids. I don't care if you're, 100 years older than I am, which would be a miracle. But you're one of mine. You're one of my kids. I love you like one of my kids. I don't care if I've only known you 10 minutes and you came to one service. You're one of my kids. It's going to hurt me when you leave. This is the way I am. But he was a police officer when he came into this. And police officers are not allowed to wear the fringe. Police officers aren't allowed to be off on the Sabbath. Police officers are not allowed to celebrate the feast of God. You can't just hand your boss there in the police thing a piece of paper at the first of every year and say, these are the days off that I'm going to take or need to take. It isn't going to work that way, is it? So can anybody can no person following God be a police officer? If you started your walk as a police officer, the answer is yes. If you did not, the answer is no, you can't. You have to obey God. But for instance, in this police officer's situation, what is required biblically is that he form a plan to either find a police officer job that will allow these things, which there actually are some, hard to find, harder to get, but there are some. And he has to find a job that, lets him obey God and wear his fringe and all of those things. It has to come along. Does it have to come along immediately? No. It could take a year. It could take 2. It could take 3. You don't, because part of God's law is you pay your bills, you keep your word, et cetera, right? So you can't just walk away and lose everything and put your family in a pup tent in your best bud's backyard or something. No, you don't do that. God doesn't allow that either. You just have to set up a plan. You don't have to do it immediately. You're going to need some time to think this through. You got to set up that plan, find a way to execute that plan. And maybe it takes a year, maybe it takes 2. If it goes beyond that, I'm not so sure of your plan. But in some cases, it may. Maybe you have to go back to college and stuff like that. I don't know. I would say that's between you and God, but the law is pretty clear on it. You've got to get this thing going. You got to start working toward that, which he and his family did. He ultimately became a truck driver, I think. Like the big semi-rig thing. But we've lost contact, so unfortunately I can't give you an update on them. I wish I could. I really loved that whole family. But in this, we know God's will. He's already told us what his will is. It's not, oh, God will understand. I'm sorry. That's you being the God of your own life. There's no God will understand. There's only the words that God spoke, and they're all the words we need to hear. Biblically speaking, hearing the voice of God was never meant to be taken literally. Hearing voices in our head telling us what to do is called selfishness. Oh, you didn't think that's what I was going to say, did you? Or multiple personality disorder. In the end, to hear God's voice means that we obey his commandments. Physical reactions such as goosebumps, trembling bodies, shouting, dancing, and even stammering lips can be caused by good music and an exciting message orated by a talented speaker I mean, go back and watch the video of those girls who used to go to the concerts by the Fab Four. I forget what they were called. The British invasion happened in the 60s. Dang, I don't remember who they were. They all did that. They had the stammering lips, they had the falling out and the rolling on the floor and the goosebumps and all of that just from those people walking out on stage. They didn't even have to be playing their instruments, right? Um, this stuff, those things can cause it. You can work yourself into a frenzy. Just I should get off that and move on to what really want to say about it. This especially happens when you're listening to an orator, I'm going to call it preacher, let's just put it out there, who's very talented. Man, they can work a crowd into a frenzy. The worship band can work a crowd into a frenzy. God's presence can invoke reactions ranging from unimaginable terror all the way up to indescribable euphoria and beyond. God's presence will hit everything from the worst all the way up to the other end, even if we don't realize we're in God's presence, right? So to connect this idea of going to a church or a synagogue, I've never seen a synagogue like that. I've heard there's some out there, don't know. But let's say there are. All of that is just human emotion. And there's nothing wrong with human emotion. If you're going to a synagogue and they've got this great band and everybody's singing and the stammering lips are going on, don't be afraid of it. What are you afraid of? You think somebody's who's is saying I tie, you tie, we all tie my bow tie, or whatever it is they're doing, you really think that that's going to hurt you in some way? You think that's going to jump out from behind your couch? And I've never understood people saying they're scared of that. I saw that for the first time in my life when I was 9 years old, thought it was the coolest thing I ever saw. I was in no way, shape, or form scared of it as a 9-year-old boy. Come on, people, grow up. The physical reaction to God's presence can and should always at all times be experienced by his children. But remember, it's going to range anywhere from the worst kind of terror that can't even be described all the way up to the greatest experience that, again, could never be described. So sometimes the presence of God will not cause a physical, emotional, frenzied experience. But I guarantee you, if God reaches out and touches you, your body's going to react. If God reaches out and kisses you on the lips, and yes, God kisses people on the lips, I promise you that you're going to do something so similar to speaking in tongues, everybody's going to think you are an old-time Pentecostal. I'm just saying. And I guarantee you, you'll spend the rest of your life looking to have that experience again. Because if God touches you, we're humans. It'll never be enough. Got to have some more of it. Guarantee it. But just remember, the presence of God should be experienced at all times, which means we need to recognize that sometimes the presence of God does not invoke goosebumps. It doesn't invoke Pentecost. Okay? I'm not saying that it didn't or that it wouldn't. I'm just saying that it won't always. Okay. feel like enough has been said about that. Are we okay on the whole? It says I have a thingy here, but I didn't hear it ding. Oh, okay. So that happened before. I guess we're still live on the YouTube thing. All right. Well, let me go to the other one then. Nice. I wanted to talk about, I'm just going to, 29 minutes. I've got 19 by my count. A little extra. I like it. Okay. Oh, it's just telling me the same thing again. I guess if I don't, oh man, what in the world just happened? Wow. I don't know what's going on. Well, all of a sudden the text message thing isn't working. Uh-oh. Anyway, if we cut off, just let me know. I'm not trying to just goof off here. I want to talk about some things in the book of Levi. They call it Matthew, New Testament stuff. Jews, you should really listen to this. I'm not talking doctrinal stuff. I'm talking custom, culture, history. That's what I want to talk about. Now, this letter, this scroll, as it was when it was written, was in fact written in the Hebrew language. It was translated later into Greek and Latin and German and English and, all kinds of languages now. But it was originally written in Hebrew. And it starts off, sorry, my computer did something very funky. The Sefer, the scroll of the generations of Yeshua HaMashiach, son of David, son of Abraham, right? And so then we go into this thing that people think of as a genealogy. Here's your history, customs, culture. It is no such thing. This is not a genealogy in any way, shape, or form. One, it's not in chronological order. Two, you get to the point where it says there were 14 generations between this one and that one. Not true. There were more than 14. So what is it? Well, I don't fully understand what this is and have had my doubts as to whether it was part of this because you don't find other Jewish scrolls from this same time period or before that had this sort of thing in it. Wait a minute, there's those things in the Old Testament, really? Was there? That's actually quite questionable. What is happening here is something that comes from something called gematria. Now, gematria is it's a numerology thing. I don't know what I don't know how to tell you what that is, but here's what I want you to know about it. The names given in this genealogy from the beginning of Matthew's scroll are different in Aharon's version of this scroll, right? So Levi, the scroll we're looking at, Matthew, we find it in Matthew 1, chapter 1, verses 1 through verses 16. They trace Yeshua's lineage via his stepfather. Now, are they doing this because Joseph was truly his physical his physical dad? No, that has nothing to do with why this is here. They put this in here, if in fact Levi did. It's here to show you that Yeshua is as Jewish as it gets. His mother was a Jew. His father was a Jew. He's a Jew. That's very important to Jews looking for Mashiach. And they're making this claim he's the Mashiach. So if he's the Mashiach, those of us who know our Torah, the Tanakh, we know that he has to be Jewish. There's no other way around that. Let me put it more simply. To be the Redeemer of Yisrael, which is what the Mashiach is supposed to be. He has to be physically related to Israel. I don't know what's going on with my phone. It's weird. So this is the setup. Now, when you get to Aharon, which is, you guys know it as Luke chapter 3, verses 23 through 38, that's not Yeshua's line. It's not connected to his mother. And, scholars say, see there, that doesn't even connect to Miriam. Mary, as most people know her, but her name was Miriam. And therefore, it's all false. No, that lineage is of Yeshua's more, of the man who taught Yeshua the Word of God. Now, we all know that it was the other way around. He was taken in by this more when he was 12 or 13. Just because he did the thing, met the man at 12, doesn't mean he immediately went with the guy. Could have been older. But we have no information on that, so we don't know when he went, but he did. And this more, his name is identified in the New Testament letters, though you would not know it by the English translation because the translators had no idea what they were looking at. His more, the name of his more was Yosef. So this man Yeshua would then, more often than not, would have been called Yeshua ben Yosef, not Yeshua, the son of the man who was married to his mother that had nothing to do with his birth. No, the Yosef, when they call him Ben Yosef, they're saying that Yosef, a man named Yosef, was his teacher. Anyway, and as I've said, there's more than 14 generations. For instance, Ahaziyahu was left out. Yoash was left out. Amaziah was left out. That kind of messes with your 14 generations, right? Well, why would they do that? Okay, not everybody in this line was a standout. Some of the people in the genealogy didn't exactly follow God's law. Some of them just didn't do anything that was important or that stood out, or there's a whole host of reasons why they would have been left out. They have picked these 14 people to represent whatever their life represented. Is Yeshua is representing all of those. These 14 that went before him, the 14 that went before them, and so on and so forth. He is the embodiment of all of those generations. That's what you're supposed to get from this. Because verse 17 is where it says, so the generations of Abraham to David are 14 generations. I just named 3 other people that got left out. So no, it's not 14. And from David until Babel, or Babylon, I guess, until the Babylonian captivity are 14. No, that's not true. And from Babel, from the Babylonian captivity until Mashiach are 14. Not true either. So you understand these 14 that are laid out in each of these, Yeshua is essentially the sum total of everything that stood out about them. Hopefully that makes some sense. I'm not sure it did. Okay, And then I wanted to talk about one other thing, because I am seriously running out of time here. Very quickly after this supposed genealogy happens, it goes right into, now Joseph, speaking of the stepdad, not the more, Joseph, her husband, speaking of Miriam, the actual name of the actual mother of Yeshua, so Mary, mother of Jesus, Joseph, her husband, who was Zedekiah, he was righteous. What does that mean to the person who wrote this? It means that this man was fully Torah observant. Now we're going to see this. If we keep reading, we're going to realize that's exactly what was meant by this. So he's Torah observant, he's righteous, and not willing to expose her publicly. Because he was righteous, he did not want to expose her publicly. He was thinking about, in the text it says, putting her to death, having her killed. What? So he's righteous, so he doesn't want to have her killed publicly, but he's okay with having her killed privately? Doesn't it seem a little weird to you? This publicly privately thing is based on two things. It's based on Deuteronomy, as it's known today, Devarim, as the Jews know it, chapter 22, verses 13 through 21. That's the first part. And the other part is first century tradition. So you need to know the tradition of the Jews in Israel in the first century. You put that together with this section of Deuteronomy, now you can understand it. By the first century, Hebrew tradition was such that marriage took place in two phases. Two. The first phase was what we would call betrothal, while the second phase was what we would call consummation. Both phases of marriage began with the passing of a cup of wine between the couple. The first one could have happened anywhere. The second one was almost always going to happen under a chuppah, the canopy that you see in so many Jewish weddings. The cup of wine would be filled to the top with wine. The groom-to-be would drink the first half of that cup, and then he would turn to the bride-to-be and probably hold it out and say something along the lines of, with this cup, we enter into betrothal. And I want you to keep the betrothal and the consummation. I'm going to use those words because I know I'm speaking to English speakers here. And once he said that, she would take the cup and drink it, right? So when the proposal happened, they would do this after the contract had been worked out verbally, and then it was written by a scribe, and then they'd get back together and they'd read this out to the woman. And if she understood it and wanted to enter into this covenant with this man, they would then become betrothed. Now that got a little wonky after a while, and people would betroth their daughters when they were far too young to understand it. So the parents would be the stand-in for this poor young woman. And then, of course, she didn't get married when she was a little girl. She would still stay with her mom and dad, and he would go stay with his parents, but, the husband-to-be. But it gets wonky because betrothal really should not start until that woman can hear with her ears, understand with her whole heart and mind, and then decide whether she wants to obey this covenant or not. So Now, no marriage was fully entered into until the consummation took place. But if this young woman or this young man or both decided, this, I want out for whatever reason, I want out. They both want out. One or the other wants out. In their world, betrothal, we think of betrothal in our world as, well, no harm, no foul, get back the ring and all is well, and we'll just move on down the road. No, in the Bible world of the first century, if that betrothal period came to, okay, we don't want to get married, they had to go to divorce court. They were legally married, even though they had not entered into the second phase. So they had to get a divorce in a divorce court. So now in Deuteronomy, we have the whole public private thing, where that comes from. When Joseph, not the More, but the stepdad, when he came to get his betrothed, now they've been betrothed, they could have been betrothed since they were very young, or probably not in that particular time, that getting, marrying off your little girls came later. Although I'm sure somebody can find an example of that happening, too soon, too early, in an earlier period. I've not seen anything that would tell me, I've not seen anything that would tell me it happened earlier, but I've certainly never seen anything that would show me that it was common. But let's say that they've been betrothed. He shows up, Joseph shows up, and Miriam is kind of big, fat, pregnant. Now, he's been at his dad's house the whole time, and supposedly she'd been at her dad's house the whole time. How did that happen? So Joseph had come to believe that Miriam had an affair. And so he gets to the point where he's like, how can I trust a woman that's going around doing this kind of thing while she's betrothed, legally married? What's she going to do when we get together? Right? So there's a big trust thing. And anytime you break that kind of trust, that's a big ordeal. And so what he's thinking about is not having this woman put to death. Now, there's this rabbi dude named Sheila. I don't know his first name or his last name. He's called Sheila. And according to Tractate Ketubah, folio 45a, he said, or taught, there are 3 modes of execution, killing people. There are 3 modes. In the case of a betrothed damsel, she is stoned at the door of her father's house, and we call that private. She is stoned at the entrance of the gate of the city. We call that public. She is condemned to strangulation. Strangulation. One can only guess that Sheila never read the Tanakh in Hebrew. Or if he did, he obviously did not understand it. If stoning a woman with stones that she dies, as it says in Hebrew, does not mean that she should be stoned to death, how in the world does he conclude that she should be strangled to death? So let's look at Deuteronomy 22:21. And they will bring out the young woman to the entrance of her father's house, and the men of the city will stone her with stones. And the problem is, neither Sheila nor most of the men they call sages They had no idea this was a Hebrew idiom. None. No clue that this was an idiom. To stone her with stones actually means to chisel her offense in the stones at the entrance of the family property or at the entrance of the city, public, private. That's actually what's meant. It does not mean you pick up stones and kill this woman, because if it did, you wouldn't want the people who would do that to be the elders of your city. It goes on. And she, wait a minute, it says, stone her with stones. I'm a little confused here. Where was I? Stone her with stones that she die. Stone her with stones that she die. So it's kind of one idiom, but it's broken into two pieces here. The second, where it says that she die, that's actually saying, and her family will live with the disgrace of her sin and her divorce. And it goes on, for she brought disgrace in Yisrael, not to Yisrael, not to her family. She brought disgrace in Yisrael to commit adultery. And I've added the little words in squiggly. While she lived, because in English that we have to do that to make it make sense in English. She committed adultery while she lived in her father's house. Thus you will remove this evil from the midst of you. Deuteronomy 22:21. Keep in mind here that the family property is passed from one generation to the other in this time and place. This woman's sin will now be permanently affixed to the entrance of that family property, or worse yet, of the city. This kind of punishment is good assurance that parents will properly raise their daughters, to be honest. If a young girl has an affair out of wedlock and becomes pregnant, God's law states that the girl and her lover must marry. Even if the young girl's lover were to abandon her and their child, the girl can enter a non-virgin marriage at any time. I mean, some guy will have her and her illegitimate child and is willing to live with the disgrace and all of that. She can get married. There is no reason why a young girl should lie about her virginity in that world. At this point in time, Joseph believed that his bride-to-be was not actually a virgin, given that she was 9 months pregnant. You get it? And because he had not consummated with her, of course, he knew he hadn't done this. Thus, Joseph was beginning to hate Miriam, in that he was thinking about how he was going to divorce her publicly or privately. Let's consider Deuteronomy 22:13. If a man takes a wife and it says go to her, what does that mean? Consummates the marriage with her. If he goes to her, if he consummates the marriage with her and hates her, Deuteronomy 22:13, and hates her, same word, and then establishes an accusation against her before the elders of the city, what it actually says literally, and lays upon her evil deeds words. Well, that means establishes an accusation against her before the elders of the city. That's what that idiom means. And brings evil upon her name and says, I took this woman and I drew near to her. I consummated the marriage. But I did not find her to be a virgin. And of course it goes on. Verse 19 tells us that if the accusation is false, chapter 22 of Deuteronomy, verse 19 tells us that if it's false, the husband will be forced to give his new bride's father 100 shekalim of silver. That's a lot of money. And the husband can never divorce her, ever, ever, ever. He's stuck with her forever if it turns out he's lying. Divorce is, of course, the reason why the new husband would make this accusation before the elders. There is no other reason to do it. You can tell everybody in town if you want to, no biggie. You go to the elders, what are you doing? You're asking them to grant you a divorce from this woman. There is no other reason. However, the new bride is allowed to ask for a divorce as it is now obvious to her that her new husband hates her. That's the word of God uses, hates her. Conversely, verse 21 tells us that if the new bride is found guilty, the divorce will be granted and the now ex-wife will be publicly recorded as an adulterer. The punishment for a man who falsely accuses his new wife of this sin is very expensive. Combine the cost of her being found innocent, the shekalim of silver and all that, you combine that with the cost of making that covenant, it's a really good deterrent to men who would otherwise commit such a sin that they would knowingly falsely accuse their wife. It's expensive. On the other hand, the severity of punishment for the woman entering a virgin covenant is much worse because she knew she was not a virgin before she consummated that marriage. She could have instituted a divorce before they went through the consummation stage. There was plenty of time for her to do such things. There was no reason for this to take place. And again, nobody dies. It's just a very ugly divorce. Okay, according to my little timer thingy, I'm out of time. So, depending on whether I get the equipment fixed or replaced rather, this week or not, maybe I'll pick up with a couple other thoughts and things, but otherwise we'll try to get to the law. Shalom v'shalom, everybody.